In today's conversation, I'll be speaking with Olga Solovyeva about Yandex, the Russian Google, and technology, politics, censorship, and leadership. The founder of Yandex, Arkady Volozh, condemns Russia's war in Ukraine. He's the second Russian business leader to go public with such criticisms, and especially from the critical technological sector. Yandex is a unique IT business which managed to stay afloat throughout the years of authoritarianism, and despite an occasional compromise with the state, maintained the reputation, or its reputation, as one of the most liberal companies in Russia to work for. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us by becoming a patron or just buy me a coffee. That is a new facility which we have implemented onto the channel. Olga Solovyeva is a social researcher with experience in higher education, business, and civil society organizations. Her areas of expertise include communication, technology, and society. She works on issues of data ethics, IT business regulation, and the relationship between the state and tech in Russia, and writes on these topics for academic, professional, and general audiences. Olga, I'm delighted to welcome you back to the channel for the second time.
Oh, thanks. Really great to be back and talk about Yandex a little.
Well, I know Yandex, we just touched on it briefly during our last conversation, but it's a critically huge topic to cover. And of course, you are one of the world's experts in this, having worked on it, I believe, for your PhD.
I've spent my past 3 years working on a PhD around Yandex, looking into their relationship with the state and the way how it's been developing. So I know quite a fair bit of the company's development history, and I also spoken with a few people working in Yandex or formerly working in Yandex. And yeah, obviously when I started, that was a very interesting case itself, given the history of Yandex engaging in a political compromise with Kremlin. However, over the past 2 years and the war with Ukraine, things escalated really quickly, and we've seen the downfall of this resilient business, which sustained this kind of apolitical, beyond politics compromise with the Kremlin, trying to be outside of it, but at the same time quite close with it. I mean, it's working its own path into nationalization at the moment, and this is quite scary, devastating, and very disappointing for, I believe, every Russian person altogether and people working in Yandex from the very beginning.
And Arkady Volozh has made quite a surprising announcement, an announcement of the Ukrainian conflict. He said that the conflict is wrong, illegal, and so on. And there aren't that many oligarchs or tech leaders, or let's face it, anyone in senior business positions within Russia who have made unambiguous statements like this. So who is Arkady Volozh? Where is he living? And what are his motivations for making this statement?
Arkady Volozh is the founder, one of the co-founders, but basically he is the main person who's standing behind Yandex, who set it up back in 1990s. He's born into a family which lived in Kazakhstan back in the Soviet Union. And and he went to a very good mathematical school where he met his future co-founder of Yandex, Ilya Sigalovich, who's deceased now, unfortunately, and he passed away back in 2014, which is devastating. And that they've been quite close friends together, and have met later in their lives when Arkady was working on another IT business and was about to develop Yandex through the program for indexing information online, right? So that was his history. He was basically an engineer. He was born in Kazakhstan, and he was raised and then came back to Moscow. He'd been leading the company from the very beginning. In 2014, indeed, probably linking it to the events in Ukraine, or in the Crimea annexation, he moved partially his business, and he started spending a lot of time in Israel, still remaining the CEO of the company, but slowly started passing his duties of a CEO towards other emerging leaders in the company. So yeah, this is the brief story of Arkady Volozh. He's a very private person, and what is really interesting about him that he's not been around on media much. So if you would be looking for his interviews, you would have an occasional one, and most of them would be coming in the first years before it became really tough and problematic for Yandex to operate within authoritarian landscape, and the most of the criticism emerged. He's never been public about his position around Yandex and its relationship with the state, its compromises, the problems around Yandex Novosti and other hot stories emerging, maintaining a very clear pro-business stance. So what I can tell about Arkady Volozh without actually meeting him, he is quite pragmatic, he's business-oriented, but he's definitely very smart and very capable of building a business of international scale. And yeah, and he keeps really quiet. So he is the deep brain behind the organizational, operational processes of building a business. And his co-founder, Ilya Sigalovich, who is another key person in the company, he was a little bit of the opposite of the personality. So he was very vocal, he was very open, he was very much driven by the values of his to develop and integrate them into the technology they produce and into the communication in the organization at Yandex, so to drive its corporate culture. And Ilya Sigalovich, before he passed away, he was quite vocal about Russia taking a liberal turn. He was seen at the protest. He would come to the office with a white ribbon and be quite provocative in a way regarding the issues going on in Russia and the protests back, like, let's say, in 2011.
But of course, he passed away before some of the key events that we see. There's Bolotnaya, which is really the major turn both of authoritarianism in Russia, but also the challenges to the status quo and Putin's regime. That's where people started to have doubts about the sort of so-called hybrid autocracy. People started to realize that the elections really were rigged, and that was the turn towards the sort of full 1984 scenario that we're seeing now. And then the invasion of Crimea. We don't know, of course, what his stance would have been on that. Did Arkady give any indications all through that time that he was that he had a political stance, or did he try very hard to remain neutral and focus on his company's business?
That's the point. That's the point. So in all the interviews I've went through, looking at the public appearances of Yandex leadership, which include Arkady Volozh, which will focus on Elena Bunino, Tigran Khudaverdyan, the most recent CEO. I mean, now he's under sanctions, so he's not technically a CEO, but still running the company from behind of the publicly available information. And the leaders of Yandex would always maintain a neutral stance, so they would stay beyond politics. And this is, a very, very common thing in Russia, I believe, right? So when you are approaching that level of superiority in the company and you have a very big responsibility, you just make this deal. So the feedback about the upcoming political turbulent events will be very toned down and never will vocally criticize what's going on. So Arcady Volozh would uphold to basic universal values and saying that, there are bad things and good things, and then it's better to have a free internet, and that it's better to do things the way democratic countries would expect us to do, and it would be nice to provide the freedom of information. However, he would back it up. We are working in a very specific context, right? So Yandex would stand for everything which is good. However, we need to confine with the legislation in the country. And the most explicit example of this is in an ongoing debate about Yandex Novosti and its algorithm, right? So Yandex Novosti was this big plugin on the story page of Yandex search browser. So when you go on Google, you usually see just the Google, and then you click, and then you see what's the day today is, what special occasion it is. And Yandex, you would have several plugins around the search line. And one of them would be the top of the news, let's say top 5, top 10 of the news appearing there. And if you just, a regular internet user, you go online and you see what's going on. I mean, it's an interesting selection of the news to have, and it provides you with background and with an information what's important now. And originally it was developed to just scan the internet and to see what content is the most popular, what has the most news, and then therefore to show it and to rank it from 1 to 5. However, later on, since the Kremlin became interested in what's going on in the country, and in the internet as the information field, particularly, intensifying over the time of Crimea annexation, a few visits had been made to Yandex leadership. And there have been a few conversations where public officials from Kremlin, they wanted to understand how the algorithm works. And they were quite clear that we don't want the kind of stuff which contradicts the agenda of the Russian Federation and the interest of Russian Federation appearing at the webpage, which is visited by millions of Russians daily. So that's been the first, conversation, 2011, 2010s, right? And from that on, the pressure on Yandex have been growing, and it's been applied in 2 ways. First one, of course, it's an informal way when there is this sort of conversation, and then there is, according to one of the investigative journalists, the head of Yandex News would have a special phone connected to the Kremlin people, so this person would be able to receive the calls directly. But then,
like Peskov, would that be like Peskov and his team? Those.
It could be. So, but it could be a number of people just, being responsible to keep an eye on what's appearing there at the top pages, at the front page of Yandex. But at the same time, Russian legislators, they're very productive, especially in summer, especially when they want to pass on some ridiculous laws. And then the laws on aggregator in 2016, I believe it was, being passed on, which would equate the news aggregator, such as Yandex, to the media, and then you have to obey all the rules and the regulations applying for that. So then over the time, Yandex had to remove from the list of indexing for this top of the news, remove all independent media, all oppositional media, of course. And then finally, the list, through this set of formal and informal interaction, was refined so it would be only featuring pro-state content. And this is quite problematic. So back to Arkady Volozh. We have this wonderful context where one of the major news sources, very popular among ordinary Russians, is now being the tool of the censorship. And then Arkady Volozh is asked directly, like, so what's going on? Why do you do this? Why would you support this kind of thing? And the response would be that we have to follow the law. We exist in the framework of the Russian law. And then produced by the leadership, this explanatory framework becomes the common sense for all the Russians. And it becomes the common sense for all Yandex employees, right? And because you can't really do anything against this. We do have a repressive law in Russia, and we have to follow that.
And of course, we know that many news sources, in fact, the only places where now you can get news sources that even come close to reporting in an objective fashion, either are being run from outside the country, or they've had to move from an offline format to online format, or have simply been shut down. Like Nova Gazeta, but you've also got Meduza, you've got Dozhd, you've got sort of bloggers who existed for a while, like Varlamov and others. You've got affiliated journalists like Michael Naki who've started. They're all basically now outside the country. They are, Ukrainians might argue differently, but they are very concentrated forms of news and commentary, often very good and actually high quality. I wouldn't say they were politically activist, but they do comment sometimes quite strongly on it, and they call a war a war. And this, this is problematic, and it's not just about news sources, it's about terminology, isn't it? It's about certain even basic words that you cannot use. So how does this work with something like Yandex? Not only do they have to block certain sources, do they also have to look out for certain words like war as opposed to special military operation, and do they have to block those results on a sort of semantic level as well as on the level of individual sources?
That's pretty much the truth, what you're talking about. Roskomnadzor is the regulatory body, very powerful in Russia, the one who produces and initiates quite a lot of new legislation, but also keep close eye on whatever is going on in the internet, in the Russian segment in the internet, obliges Yandex as the provider of the search engine and as the provider of certain type of media resources. And here we need to make a note that all media assets such as Yandex News, the aggregator of the news, and Yandex Zen, the blogging platform, had been sold to VK, another, well, now nationalized pretty much media company, which has a number of assets, including VK and Odnoklassniki, which are the most popular social media in the country, as well as gaming assets. So after the invasion of Ukraine, the criticism became a little bit too much, and then the deal, the sale of these assets has been escalated. So it's not the problem of Yandex; they got rid of these toxic assets. However, Roskomnadzor used to and still keeps an eye on what is published online, and then Yandex will have to make sure that the information which appears online and in the search does not cross with the restrictions of Roskomnadzor. So this is their legal obligation to clean the internet from the content which violates Russian legislation. So content removals are the regular part of the Yandex business. And if you will see, what kind of search results appearing there, it's quite important. And we understand that today no one can really go and check on all the information sources. We all do rely on these algorithms. So we rely on search algorithms. We rely on the algorithms that create us different prioritized content. And we hope that the recommendation systems actually work and they provide us with the results we really need. So when we want to see the truth, we usually look at the first 2 pages of the search results on either Google or Yandex search. So here, with the Roskomnadzor and their interest, and then their frequent requests for content removal, which come directly to Yandex, Yandex has to comply with most of them.
Mm. And do all those come from the state? Sorry to interrupt. Do all those come from the state, those requests? Or is there also a role for informants like Danosy, people flagging up things they don't like? Or does that not play a role?
This could be a thing. Yeah, I think this could be a thing. Then there is the right to be forgotten, for instance, and Yandex would receive quite a number of removal requests from the people who just want to remove the information online. And again, so just to highlight the ambivalence and the uniqueness of Yandex as a business, Yandex has received quite a lot of requests for removing the content, from Roskomnadzor Roskomnadzor and from people who just think that there is too much liberal stuff going on into agenda. So yes, it might not be the NOSU, but that could be, you know, just the users who flagging up the content, for instance, in Yandex Zen, the content which would violate the law in their view of the reality. And at the same time, Yandex tries to pretend independent media. For instance, when Yandex Zen was launched and then MBH Media appeared first, the Khodorkovsky Media appeared, they moved to this platform being banned everywhere else. So just finding it over there. They soon received the request from Roskomnadzor to remove and to get rid of this media. However, they rejected this for the first time and yet had to comply a week later. So that was not a very strong and long fight, but they've been a number of attempts, especially driven by, you know, single individuals employed in the company who still have their own values. And it contributed to this dynamic between the Kremlin, Roskomnadzor pressure, and the kind of people who want and who believe in the power of technology and who want to do a good thing around it, or at least not to give up that easily.
And we'll come on to the special circumstances, because, of course, Russia is now at a full-scale war, and we'll examine this idea of neutrality and whether that is even possible under these circumstances anymore. But let's turn to Arkady a bit more. Let's dig into the statement he's made, and I'd like to know how bold it actually is, but also, is he putting both himself and his company at risk of a more aggressive kind of takeover of the state? And I'm assuming here that he's not actually based in Russia, because, you know, the probability of having an open window related incident, I'm sure, is pretty high if you are criticizing the war itself.
The statement was quite bold, and in the statement he does denounce the war, and he condemns the war in Ukraine and saying that this is a terrible thing and he cannot support this. He also dwells into, you know, into an attempt to explain himself a little bit. Particularly, he's saying that his statement might have come a bit too late and not very timely, which is the case, right? So you would not expect a business leader to go through a year and a half into the war in Ukraine, conflict and whatever is going on, while, you know, being unnoticed. And he says that he has his own personal reasons to do that, this is his statement. And I would not be surprised at all that there had been a direct pressure applied by the state officials on Arkady Volozh. Because again, according to the investigative journalists, Arkady had tried to get rid of his media assets, the toxic assets, for a while, and he wanted to do something around Yandex Novosti. He and his, of course, top management who've been running this resources. However, he was told no. And I would not be surprised if he was somehow intimidated, or there is another way of gaining conflicting interests, which didn't let him to go vocal a bit earlier. However, at the same time, I believe that Arkady Volozh is a very pragmatic person. And again, looking at the story of Yandex and how its product's been developing. In Yandex, we need to acknowledge this. They have the whole range of fantastic services. So from the search engine to this blogging platform to ride-sharing services and car sharing services to delivery services, self-driving cars, and cloud solutions. So this is the whole range of different things which are being produced, and it brings massive pride in the domestic product, but at the same time, a massive convenience for people living in Russia. And with this range of things going on, I believe Arkady was facing the dilemma to continue doing the good things and occasionally compromise in something, or just to put it all on stake and then get rid of this and lose his business. And the background thing is money. It's going there. And if you look at the chart of Yandex financial performance, you will see a strikingly high results with occasional dips, from time to time, usually coming along with some bold statements from Russian authorities trying to put another legislative pressure on Yandex and make them do their own thing. Their share prices would drop a little bit, but then Yandex would recover. And the majority of services which brought financial stability to Yandex, they were not political. Well, I mean, at least at the very superficial level, they were not political. That would be a Yandex taxi, for instance. That would be, the main driver of the profit. So I think that in his, again, this is a big speculation, in his picture, there was the potential of the company and the development of services and the context of authoritarianism, which goes quite slowly into a very tight area. But this is the dynamics of the people living in an authoritarian regime. You got used to it. And then you invent yourself, and then you reinvent yourself, and then you reinvent your business under the circumstances, because this is what you have to deal with, right? And that was the logic, most likely. And again, even thinking about that, he relocated himself and his family to Israel, and he starting his new thing over there. So probably he could sense the severity of the impact that this collaboration with Yandex is having on his business, on his reputation, and on the future of the company. Well, could have been a bit faster. Could he have been thinking about it in a bit bold way? Or could they at least have been thinking about launching Yandex Zen well after Crimea annexation and understanding the censorship laws which already are imposed in the country? Yes, I believe that would be the biggest ethical kind of violation which I can acknowledge when you're looking at the interviews of two top managers of Yandex Zen in 2018 to the Bell, one of the independent Russian media, where they're saying that they are building the television of the future in this country. So 2018, you cannot build the television of the future. Television is the terrible thing in Russia. This is the machine of propaganda. So probably if their technological decisions and leadership decisions have been focused on some other things, Yandex would exist for a little bit longer. Anyway,
so you think he's prioritized safeguarding his financial assets potentially? He's prioritized maybe moving or offshoring some of his activities so that if the Russian state, and this is very speculative, that if the Russian state were to confiscate his business, he's managed to establish himself and other operations enough so that he wouldn't be dare I say, impoverished by it. Now, there are some examples of this, aren't there? I mean, the examples of Khodorkovsky having his UCOS business stolen. He obviously lost most of that, but managed to get some of those assets abroad because he's still, investing heavily, as you say, in media and oppositional activities. You have Evgeny Chitvarkin, his Everset, which also was confiscated in extremely, I would say, financially negative circumstances for him. But again, he managed to get some assets out, enough to provide the seed capital for new businesses abroad. There are plenty of examples of this. So Arkady must have planned that by looking at what has almost inevitably happened to other people's businesses. The moment they start speaking about the Kremlin, it's guaranteed pretty much that your business will be taken and probably handed to some, dare I say it, sort of compliant friend of the regime.
This is the question. I don't know why it wasn't done earlier, and understanding that Arkady Volozh is a smart manager, is a very thoughtful leader, and he can plan way ahead. What we've seen over the past year and a half since Arkady Volozh has been sanctioned by the EU and I believe by the US as well, but I might be wrong. So, and he had to step down from the leadership of Yandex, and then they started preparing the deal of separating international and Russian assets in Yandex. So that was a big divorce. And for a year and a half, I believe the tech specialists are still trying to separate the technological stack of products because they're just so interrelated. And unfortunately, we don't know yet whether the deal's been confirmed, because the number of people who can be the buyers of the Russian part of Yandex, they're also under sanctions. So the list has been shortened drastically. So I believe it's still in the process of negotiation. But then the statement of Arkady Volozh might be the identificator of the move towards more progressive state of the affairs around this. So probably they've decided on something, and then he could go that bold. And then he probably got, the chunk of money. But we don't know. And I hope that some of this information will become public. For me, what was missing from that statement is exactly the following, is the way how a leader of the company, which he was running for 20 years, engaging in multiple compromises with the senior Kremlin officials, condemning this war, making this statement. I would expect him to explain what is happening, why the behavior was just like that, and what is he planning to do to contribute back to the society for all the wrongdoing which was conducted under his leadership, and whether he sees this as a wrongdoing. So it would be nice just to have his perspective on the matter of things, to understand why things been done in this way, not in the other.
Well, let's dig into that, because over 20 years, we know to an extent how the regime works. If a company like Yandex has data about people's search history, and there can be a lot of significant information in that search history. It can show not just where you buy stuff and what you buy. It can show your political affiliations, what you're interested in, what news you consume. And if you are doing this not via a VPN, or even with a VPN, it may be that Yandex has some fairly interesting information, which the FSB might find quite useful. And in the circumstances of a full-scale war, the conscription office might find quite useful when it's trying to track down individuals to get them to join the army. So we also know that a whole number of laws have been introduced in the last couple of weeks alone around electronic conscription and sort of sending people details and ensuring that that they get called up for the army. Is it because potentially of this sort of increasing demands of the state and intrusiveness into digital data? Is a company like Yandex even viable in these circumstances, or the concept of neutrality, does it have any meaning anymore?
Too many things in one question, Jonathan. So the first beat is the data. Personal data is the newest obsession of Kremlin, and not it's been there for a while, and it's even personal obsession of Vladimir Putin, as was discussed briefly before the started recording this podcast. He's been focusing on digital superiority of Russia and using personal data, monetizing on personal data, and seeing in trend with all the Western thinkers the personal data as the new oil. And of course, outside from this monetization principles, which is still quite a big thing, the FSB has its interest in trying to persuade people to do things they want and obtaining this personal data to achieve their own goals. And for that matters, the number of data handovers been quite dramatic in Russia, and Yandex have received quite a few of this. What an interesting thing is that this is the data handover and data requests. They are very common, and all the countries, they have them, right? So you need to have usually the decision of the court to ask for this data, to request this data from a digital company, and then they will have to provide it to you if they find this in accordance with the legislation of this company. And it helps a huge deal. It helps to solve crimes. It helps to know where people have been. It helps to dig into, some cybersecurity issues and stuff like that. It is helpful. In the context of Russia, this could be also used for the worse. Right. And it could have been a traffic accident, and then your personal data will help you to identify that you've been here in the place. But it could have been, you could have been on the protest, and then your personal data will help you to be identified as the one of participants of this protest, and then you receive a fine for joining the process or the protest which has not been approved by the authorities. And this is a totally different story. So Yandex did receive a number of such requests, and they've been handing them over to the government because, again, they have to work in accordance with the Russian legislation. And the Russian law, with the law on sovereign internet and Yarovaya law, has been creating the infrastructural obligations for storing this data for a long time, and then handing over this kind of data under an easier procedural way. However, to talk about Yandex, they've been the first and the only company in the country which issued what's called transparency reports. Absolutely voluntary thing to do, where they openly published for each 4 months. Each 4 months, they would update the number of data requests and the number of data handover requests which have been satisfied based on their statistics. So at least they went public with this data. And I believe that that was a very big step forward. First, in terms of virtue signaling, right? Look at us. It's not us. That's FSB. They coming to us with their stupid data requests, and then we have to do it, but we don't give them too much. We try to leave as much as possible for us until, so we don't bring them this data voluntarily. And and at the same time, it helped to encourage civil society to do something about this, right? However, in 2022, these transparency reports have been not published anymore. I believe that there have been some difficulty in taking this project on, and that was very disappointing for me to find out. So with the issues of data, Yandex is the holder of a lot of data and is responsible for storing this data. They've been trying to resist the state in going too far, but they can't do too much if there would be a very pushy request from the FSB to have this. And at the same time, there is international business of Yandex, right? And that was the recent investigation published in Medusa, the recent report by the journalists about the Russian business and foreign business of Yandex. And apparently FSB wants to have this access to data constantly now and try to make it a legal route to have it from the Russian businesses, so obliging Yandex to provide with this data. However, the businesses located in Europe, they fall under GDPR protection, which directly forbids. And then we have this conflict of interest. And there is the question to Yandex, how they going to separate this data, because this data appears under one account. So for instance, if I first took taxi from Moscow just to go somewhere to the Red Square, and then I traveled to Paris and decided to take a taxi in Paris or in Finland or wherever Yandex taxi is present, the data of my location will be stored still on the Russian server. And apparently they have to hand it over to FSB, but it will violate the GDPR rule. So there is an intricate ethical and technological problem to be solved further on.
But that's actually an extraordinary insight there, which I hadn't quite sort of even twigged there, because you talked earlier about these businesses which are nominally considered neutral. So that could be food delivery, that could be taxi services, could be entertainment, watching movies and so on. These things are nominally neutral. But when the state starts trying to track you down based on your digital footprint, because it wants you to conscript you for a genocidal war, suddenly there is no neutrality, and every little scrap of digital data is is either potentially it has to be hidden from the state, which violates the law, or suddenly becomes complicit in this entire authoritarian, aggressive machine.
Absolutely. And I don't have an answer to that. And this is a big question. And I'm looking at Yandex. Yandex has been quite unlucky to emerge from this unhealthy context and been developing in this unhealthy context. And probably the organization has to be more resilient and focused on its values and uphold to the major obligations and responsibilities which come to you when you are the technology provider. Technology is an interesting field. It comes before the regulation appears. It makes such a change. We have no clue how it's going to impact us. All this discussion about artificial intelligence and stuff like that, right? So we don't know what are the consequences. And as I've been looking at Yandex and its services, one of the most fascinating thing was the best thing Yandex ever done. And it comes with the IT and tech education. So mathematical education and computer science education. And the programs they've been voluntarily providing opportunities for people and for children from very underprivileged backgrounds to have a degree, to have the knowledge to become programmers, right? And then they're growing this new generations of Kulibins all across from Moscow to Khabarovsk, and they come in very, very deprived, socially deprived areas, and then they have their chance to go and travel to Moscow, to travel to other major Russian cities and to have their career. And you think about it as a very good thing, which has nothing to do with politics. However, once you don't integrate the special values into the curricula, and when you just teaching technology and nothing else, you will have this new generation of programmers and IT leaders who do not have anything behind them, and then they can work for Yandex, but they also can work for Skolkovo, they can work for Rostec. And Rostec, we know, is explicitly engaging with the military technology development. And then you have these people and you empower these people. Is this an intended or unintended consequences, right? So it's unintended, of course, but it is there. The same thing with their food delivery services. With the food delivery services, which is fantastic. I mean, this is the most convenient thing you have. You wake up there and you want a pizza and you have it in 10 minutes. You want your groceries delivered in 15 minutes, they're there. And at the same time, the whole supply chain and the whole technological process behind this food delivery, which benefits the middle class, it had to be powered by the people. But the people from underprivileged backgrounds, again, who have to work for very little money. And they have to drive these taxi cars and they have to deliver you food. And Yandex encourages this. And Yandex exploits, I mean, they build the technology which help them to monetize and to support their business and to develop cloud solutions and self-driving cars. But the money and the resources, they're coming from the people who are working really hard to meet their ends. And it is not fair, first of all, but at the same time, it contributes to social inequality. And this is also a very political thing. And then the last, but not the least, Yandex bought Kinopoisk, and they've been showing Sluga Narod, the rest of the servants of the people, the TV show with Vladimir Zelensky being an actor there. And they've been having this show Last Minister, Последний Minister, which is a brilliant show, which is a political satire, right? But at some point, they will have to negotiate, like every piece of art shown in Russia coming under the criticism and under the censorship, they will have to negotiate in which way they're gonna show these videos or not. So, and even the entertainment service becomes political. So you have the whole stack of things and they are amazing, but they have consequences. And even the self-driving car, I mean, Vladimir Putin would be very happy to come, to his audiences and in his another annual presidential address to Federal Assembly to brag about, the greatness of the country, which has self-driving cars running in Yasenevo. So
there's an interesting question, and we're almost out of time, but
there's so many areas I can dig into, but let's concentrate on the specifics there. I mean, also these high-tech businesses, which have created extraordinary infrastructure, have tried to create the sort of innovation that you see in Silicon Valley and so on, and that same kind of culture and innovation. They're bringing people from poorer backgrounds, as you say. So that's ostensibly good if you invest in these people, but also, even if these people have some political awareness, they may not want to challenge it because they know where they've come from. They don't want to go back to those impoverished backgrounds. So you're creating a whole, if I understood this correctly, a whole sort of set of highly educated engineer class. What is disturbing as well, and that's a good thing nominally, as you say, but what we're also finding out is that Russia is now getting vast supplies of drones, and drones, extremely high-tech equipment, which are being used to target and attack not the Shaheeds, not only the Shaheeds, which are attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. There are now talk of massive amounts of drones being used on the front line in the south and the east. Now, these require servers, they require operators, they require technological infrastructure, which perhaps the Russian army would not have had previously. So they must also be calling upon these huge numbers of engineers who've been trained up by the Russian tech industry, civilian tech industry. And I can only imagine, you know, many of those will now be on the front. Probably is better for them to be a tech operator than being used right on the front lines to, you know, charge. You know, the mortality rate is going to be appalling if you're a frontline soldier, and tech operator is going to be preferential as individuals. But you also then, therefore, can make this connection that the Russian tech sector is powering this high-tech aggression at the same time, indirectly.
So it's difficult to say because I do not have an insight in exact, you know, backgrounds of people who are coming there. What I know for sure that the Russian IT human resources are great, and people have a benefit of very strong mathematical skills, school of mathematics, which have been like inherited from the Soviet Union, which lays the grounds for the further development. And at the same time, there is the social problem, I think, and the problem of integration of Russia into the world society, right? And if we not just pose this question in the terms of what is good and what is bad from our own perspective, because we know how the technology is being used, but if we put ourselves in the place of a person who's coming from underprivileged background, finally getting their salary, finally getting their place in life, and not actually being capable of writing, communicating in English, not being provided with any opportunities or any interest, to be fair, for international integration, they have their country, and they have their country which might be engaged in something which is wrong, but they do have professional opportunities to be developing there, right? And this is what they do. So there is a lot of potential, but then there is no awareness about either the consequences or about the alternatives. And I believe the lack of alternatives, it would influence the way how your ethical values are set and how your boundaries for decision-making are set. And for this matter, I believe the role of leaders in IT companies is exceptionally important. And I believe that this is the role which Yandex failed with going apolitical, because Yandex quite mindfully imposed this "we are beyond politics" framework and vision, and the leaders were projecting this policy, right? Not the policy of their vision, but it eventually is going to be picked up by less senior employees. And despite there have been quite a few very prominent managers in Yandex who've been vocal and went against the war, and who've been leaving the country and who've been leaving the company and been very critical, the majority of the people, they have to deal with the daily problems. They have their work, and they have their growing team of very different people coming from very different backgrounds. Not necessarily they'll have to be liberal Russians. They can be just apolitical Russians themselves. So when their leadership is apolitical, there is no incentive and then there is no room for the political discussion. And effectively, what was happening is the depoliticization of the company. And with the depoliticization of the company, you have these values evaporated. And with these values evaporated, you can't expect people to make ethical decisions based on political judgments because there is no room for it. So this is why I think it is very important to talk about the responsibility of people doing technology, because it's technology. It has such vast impacts in all the spheres of lives, and you have to be responsible for embedding the values in the technology, in the development of your organizational procedures, communication. And I don't ask this for being overall very political, but at least, I don't know, triggering some critical thinking and challenging opinions. And it's not the problem of Yandex only. This
I was
is
about
also
to say that, isn't it? I mean, I was going to make that point towards the end because I know the comments would go like, oh, you're always having a go at Russia, but what about Google, Microsoft, many other companies will self-censure their results if they are operating in other authoritarian regimes, of which Russia is not the only one in the world. They have operations around the world. I mean, famously, Google, in China, has withdrawn its operations because it just found they were too onerous, the requirements there. But there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on, and that's wrong, entirely wrong.
It is entirely wrong, and we still are to think about the solution to this problem. And you know that I don't have much of the opinion about the tech leaders of these big tech companies who capitalize on the worst things in humans and try to monetize on that, and being a bit overpaid as well. So I think that bringing back the dilemma in pursuing the profit and the extent to which you're pursuing the profit, and then granting the basic freedoms for people. And this is something which is put through the United Nations Declaration on Information, right? So there is the freedom of information, there is a freedom of expression, there are fundamental human rights. I believe if we could expand the discussion on human rights and empower civil society and dog watchers to take a look on the company's deeds elsewhere. Microsoft, not good. Facebook, terrible. Facebook, absolute meta. Oh no, Mark Zuckerberg, if you've seen me, in real life, I would have a very long conversation with you, sir. And there is a big important, urgent issue to be solved. But it's not also the only problem of tech. The same thing is happening with Brexit in the UK, when there is this political division. Might cause the internal pressure in the company, so it would just explode. So people would try to minimize, and they would not discuss the consequences of Brexit, right? And not discussing the consequences of Brexit, it's also traumatic, because you need to go through this to have the discussion and to clear your mind. And people might have different opinions, but there are direct consequences of this. You can't accept the fact that it just happened and we just moving on. So more room for a discussion, not much of a solution, I'm afraid.
Now, there's definitely more angles there to pursue. But Olga, this has been absolutely fascinating. You know that I'm deeply interested in technology, and especially digital technology. So this, for me, is an incredibly absorbing conversation. I hope the audience finds it so as well. And I wanted to thank you again for your time. We will put some links in there to your articles on this topic especially. We'll pop those in the description of the video, and people can ask further questions in the comments, so we can keep this debate going. Olga, thanks so much.
So much, Jonathan. I hope one day we'll manage to save the world.